So even if you didn't pay the king, you still had to do as your lord commanded. And usually that meant farming, no matter what your social class was. When the sun came up, it was time to get to work. In fact, work was expected of everyone except children under the age of 7, monks, and of course women who were busy bearing children. The men in the village were all farmers, and they spent their days tending to the fields. Women worked alongside them during planting and harvesting. Seasons, but for the rest of the year. They were more likely to be found spinning flax or working as a lowly servant in the home of the Lord or some other wealthy merchant. On a normal day, the men would tend to crops and livestock, repair fences and equipment, and even cut wood for building or heating purposes. If you were a man who owned your own small plot of land, you would spend some time after sunrise tending to your vegetable garden. This was the only time in a peasant's life when they could truly have some freedom. They could grow whatever vegetables they wanted and sell the excess for profit at the local market. Women, on the other hand, were responsible for gathering water from a nearby well or spring and gathering fuel for fires. It was also their responsibility to cook meals for their family, mend clothes, and take care of the children. For the lucky families in the village, there might be enough money to hire another woman as a servant. But most peasant families had to rely on the labor of their children to help around the house. But wait, you might be saying, isn't it cruel to make children work like that? Well, no, actually it wasn't. During the Middle Ages, children were considered little adults, and they were expected to work just like anyone else. In fact, children began working around the age of 6 years old. They were in charge of taking care of animals, gathering firewood, and helping their mother with household chores. Once they got a bit older, they would start helping out in the fields as well. While the men and women of the village were hard at work, their children were at school. Wait a minute, did I just say that? Peasants had schools? That's right. Most villages, no matter how small, had at least one schoolhouse where the local priest or a highly educated villager taught the children their lessons. Usually, the only subjects taught in these schools were reading, writing, and arithmetic. The wealthy children of lords and nobles might attend a more advanced school where they were taught in Latin and studied theology. After a long morning of work, it was finally time for lunch. Most peasants packed a simple meal with them while they worked and ate while they took a break. Their lunch might consist of bread, cheese, fruit, nuts, or maybe even leftovers from the night before. Some wealthier peasants might also bring ale along with their food. Lunch was also a great time for gossip. And if there was anything the peasants loved more than gossip, it was complaining about the quality of the ale at the local tavern. Taverns were a favorite place for peasants to meet and socialize. They would discuss politics, religion, and pretty much everything else that was on their mind. More often than not, the conversations in a tavern would turn into arguments. Arguments would then lead to fistfights and sometimes even to duels. Peasants would fight over just about anything, including religion. In fact, during the Middle Ages, peasants were responsible for some of the worst religious conflicts the world has ever seen. When you spent all day working in the fields, your mind had plenty of time to wander. And many peasants used that time to question things like the teachings of the church or the existence of God himself. Unfortunately, when peasants questioned the teachings of the church, they were often branded heretics and persecuted for their beliefs. Sometimes this persecution would turn into full-on pogroms, where peasants would attack Jews, Muslims, and other religious minorities in massive waves of violence. As soon as the sun began to set, it was back to work for everyone in the village. At this time, everyone would come together to finish the Lord's portion of the harvest, or to complete a project the Lord had assigned to them. You see, the Lord was very generous, and he required his peasants to complete projects for him on roughly 2 days out of every week. These projects usually had to do with his land or his home, so you might find yourself repairing a road, a bridge, or even the Lord's castle. Once that was finished, you might be tasked with attending to the animals, collecting their food, and cleaning their stalls. If you were a peasant who lived in a village near a castle, you might have been able to catch the end of the royal court proceedings. As entertainment, medieval courts would host events such as jousting matches and theatrical performances. While you couldn't participate, you might have been able to sneak in and watch for free. Finally, it was nighttime. After a long day of work, the peasants gathered together in their huts and enjoyed a simple dinner with their family. The menu varied greatly depending on the season, but a typical meal might consist of bread, vegetables, cheese, and maybe some meat. Ale was also a common addition to dinner, and it was safe to drink as long as it was boiled first. Peasants slept in the same room that they ate and worked in. The rooms were usually very dark and smelled of stale waste. This might sound disgusting to us, but remember that during the Middle Ages, people didn't know about germs. A peasant might share their bed with their children and livestock, and that wouldn't be considered any more unsanitary than anything else. Now, this is where things get really gross. Waste would pile up in the corner of the room and would often be used as a fertilizer for the vegetable garden. If you're having trouble falling asleep, consider this. The average medieval peasant only lived to be around 35 years old. Life was incredibly difficult, and the chances of dying young were extremely high. Accidents, disease, and war claimed many lives during the Middle Ages, and most peasants died before they reached the age of adulthood. Those that did reach adulthood often didn't live much longer because, well, let's just say that indoor plumbing hadn't been invented yet. A long day of work, terrible sanitation, exposure to deadly diseases, and religious persecution. No wonder you're exhausted. But wait, it's only Thursday, and you still have to live through an entire week in the life of a medieval peasant. I hope you're enjoying this series so far. We've covered ancient Egyptian, Greek, Roman, medieval, and now we're on to Renaissance life. Let me know in the comments which era you'd like to see next, and as always, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode. The rooster crows, but you're already awake. In fact, you've been awake for hours. The night before there was a storm, and rain is still pounding against the roof of your hut. You get up, dress quickly, grab your staff and bucket, and head out into the gray dawn. You live in a rural village in 13th or 14th century Europe, somewhere in what is now likely England, France, or Germany. It doesn't matter that much where, because life here is the same no matter where you go. You're probably a serf or a villain, which means you're tied to the land you work. Though technically a slave, at least you're not a bond villain. At least your lot in life is not so bad. You have a home, however humble, and some measure of personal freedom. And as long as you pay your dues to the church and the lord of the manor, you can tend your small garden plot and maybe even keep a pig or two. After all, this is a Christian country. And while you were sleeping, the church bells chimed the canonical hours, calling the faithful to prayer. You aren't particularly religious, but you know the prayers by heart. You dutifully recite them under your breath and make the sign of the cross. That's good enough for God, and the priest will be pleased when he comes to collect his tithes later. Now it's time to get to work. You walk past the tavern. Ah, you remember last night. You had a flagon of ale with some of the other villagers after the weekly market. You weren't particularly drunk, just a little tipsy. You sang songs, told jokes, traded gossip, and felt alive for a few precious hours away from the drudgery of your life. But the tavern is closed. It won't open again until after sundown, when men want to forget their aching limbs and tired hearts. You pass the well where earlier you drew water for your family. You greet a neighbor who tells you about her sick child. You wish her well and continue on your way. The village is small, just a cluster of huts and houses, a mill and a church, a well, a couple of barns, and a field. There's also the Lord's manor house, imposing and grand, though you rarely see him. He lives in the city and has more pressing concerns than peasants in his territory. You work in the fields from dawn till dusk, planting, weeding, harvesting. It's backbreaking work, but someone has to do it. Food must be grown, and it might as well be you. The fields belong to the lord of the manor, but you've been working them since before you could walk. The soil is rich, and the weather is good. It should be a bountiful year. If the rains hold off during harvest, that is, and if the miller doesn't cheat you on the grain, that's always a worry. But then your father taught you how to smuggle in extra grain by hiding it in your clothes, under your cloak, under your shoes, even in your shirt. You and the other peasants are skilled at this game, and even the old village wives manage to get by with it. Sometimes you stop your work to watch a traveling entertainer perform. A juggler or acrobat or musician passes through the village and everyone gathers to watch. It's a welcome distraction, even if the performance lasts only an hour. You finish your work around noon and head back to the village. You need to complete your quota, and you don't want to disappoint the lord of the manor. But once that's done, you have a few hours to yourself. You spend the afternoon in the village, bartering for supplies at the market, gossiping with friends over a mug of ale, or perhaps visiting one of the women in the village. It's hard to be romantic in a world full of grime and hunger, but love still finds a way. Maybe you have a secret boyfriend or girlfriend and you meet up and share a stolen kiss, dreaming of a time when you might be free to be together openly. But those dreams are rare and tenuous. You play games with your children and watch them run around in the streets. They'll grow up quickly and become little workers themselves. When they're old enough, you might teach them how to fish in the river or catch rabbits in the fields. Not every peasant has the luxury of time to teach their children, but they learn by watching. You're too busy to notice the sun sinking lower in the sky. Evening falls and you head home. Your wife is waiting for you and she greets you at the door. She asks about your day, and you tell her everything. You tell her about the fine young woman you saw at the market today, the one with the flowing hair and gentle eyes, and she laughs. She knows you well and isn't jealous. She understands the fleeting nature of such thoughts. You eat supper with your family and leftovers from yesterday's dinner. Perhaps a crust of bread, a bit of cheese, some dried meat or fruit preserves. It's not much, but it's enough. Sometimes you eat greens from your garden and root vegetables like potatoes and carrots. Hunting is forbidden in the Lord's territory, but fishing is allowed, so your children might have caught some fish for you to eat. You pray again for the second time tonight. It's time with your family, asking God to watch over you and keep you safe from harm. The older you get, the more you understand the fragility of life. Accidents and illnesses can wipe out an entire family in weeks. Even a harsh winter can kill more people than the sword. Your hut is dark and dank and it smells like stale waste and chamber pots, but it's yours. The roof keeps the worst of the rain out and the wind off. It's made of mud and sticks and thatch. Inside, there's a hearth and chimney made of stone. Your furniture is a table and stools made of wood, a chest for your clothes, a shelf to hold your meager dishes, and a stool for each member of your family. There isn't much else to own. Life is hard. Your hands are calloused from work and your body aches from a day spent bending over the soil. Your clothes are dirty and tattered and barely protect you from the elements. You'd love to take a bath, but baths are rare luxuries. Everyone's too busy and there's no public bathhouse in your village. But you wash your face and hands in a bowl and try to scrub the grime off your skin. It's not much, but it's something. There's a knock at the door and you start. Who could it be? After dark, you tell your wife to lock the door and hide the valuables. Better safe than sorry. Peasants aren't robbed often, but when it happens, it's usually by a member of the clergy. And right now, empty-handed, you feel vulnerable. You open the door cautiously and find a tax collector standing there. He asks for your due to the king, the Lord, or the church. It's never enough, and you resent the parasites who demand tribute, but offer no protection in return. You hand over your payment, and the man leaves. You close the door and breathe a sigh of relief. Back to normal. Now it's time for bed. You tuck your children in first, then you and your wife sleep in the corner next to the fire. You wrap yourselves in blankets and drift off to sleep, listening to the rain beating against the roof. You'll wake up again before sunrise, and the cycle will begin anew. You might grumble about your fate, but you know no other life. This is your world. The land, the church, and the lord of the manor might rule you, but you're not entirely without power. You have the satisfaction of a job well done, the love of your family, the comfort of routine, and the pride of knowing you redoing your best to survive in a difficult world. In the morning, you might even hear music. The Lord's son is passing by with his retinue, celebrating something or other. You stand by the road and watch them go by. The young lord smiles at you and you nod politely. He won't remember your name, but you'll remember his. This is your life. You are a medieval peasant. Thank you for watching. It's time to get up. The roosters have been crowing for a while now, and it's time to start your day. What does a day in the life of a medieval peasant look like? Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Today we're talking about a day in the life of a medieval peasant. If you enjoy learning about history, then make sure to subscribe so you can learn something new every day. Now let's get to it. In this series, we briefly explore what life was like during the Middle Ages through the experiences of those who lived it. The Middle Ages were a long period of time, starting from the fall of Rome in 476 AD and lasting until the Renaissance in the 15th century. This was a time of great change and upheaval, but also of cultural and intellectual flourishing. We often imagine the Middle Ages as a time of knights and castles, but the reality was that most people who lived during this time were peasants. Peasants were the backbone of medieval society. They were the ones who grew the food, made the clothes, and built the homes that allowed the nobility to live their lavish lifestyles. But they also had their own culture, customs, and traditions. In fact, much of what we associate with medieval life today, such as the use of Latin and the Catholic religion, can be traced back to the influence of the peasantry. So come with me as we take a journey back in time to experience one typical day in the life of a medieval peasant. Before we begin, remember to hit that like button if you're enjoying this video. It helps us a lot. Let's do this. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, our peasant family stirred from their slumber. Their small cottage, made of mud and wattle, was already filled with the sounds of the morning. Roosters crowed outside, competing with the distant sound of church bells announcing the coming of dawn. In the flickering light of the oil lamp hanging from a wooden beam, they could see the faces of their 4 children. 3 boys and a girl, all fast asleep in their simple beds. For our family, sleep had been short and fitful, often broken into 2 segments: the first sleep from dusk till midnight, and the second sleep from 2 a.m. till dawn. A full night's rest was rare. Now it was time to begin their day. The father, a sturdy man with hands gnarled from years of toil, rose first. He crossed himself, a habit he had formed after years of prayer, and said a quick prayer to God for protection throughout the day. His wife, her face lined with the hardships of her life, woke next. She too made the sign of the cross before rising. After all, they were devout Catholics and knew the importance of God's blessing in their lives. With the eldest boy, Thomas, now 12, helping his father, they prepared themselves for the day ahead, while the younger children still slept. The couple washed their hands and faces in a basin of water, a luxury not afforded to many peasants. Thomas, eager to please his father, shaved his face with a simple razor made from a sharpened piece of flint. For the men, shaving was seen as a sign of maturity, and was usually done only by those who were married or older. After dressing in their rough woolen tunics, it was time for breakfast. The family gathered around a small table, each taking a piece of coarse bread. The bread was heavy and dense, made from unrefined flour and water. They dipped their bread into a mug of ale for the father and wine for the mother. A watered-down version of the previous night's supper, ale was a common drink among peasants. It was made from leftover grain and was safer to drink than water, which often contained animal and human waste. Wine, though more expensive, was reserved for special occasions. Each family member ate in silence, lost in thought as they prepared for the day ahead. The father, a tenant farmer, knew that his day would be filled with the endless tasks required to keep the farm running. The harvest was near, and there was much work to be done. The mother, responsible for the household and its finances, worried about the cost of the new taxes imposed by the lord of the manor. And young Thomas, dreaming of adventures beyond the farm, wondered about the world outside their village. When they had finished their meager breakfast, it was time to get to work. Father and Thomas gathered their tools and headed out into the fields. They walked. They discussed the plans for the day. The father, with his deep knowledge of farming, explained the importance of each task and the challenges they might face. Thomas listened attentively, eager to learn the ways of the farm. As they worked side by side, a sense of camaraderie grew between them. The rhythm of their labor was a dance as old as time itself. They planted, weeded, and harvested, their movements becoming almost automatic. By midday, the sun beat down on their backs, making their linen shirts stick to their skin. But they didn't stop. There was too much to do. Meanwhile, back at the cottage, the mother had woken the younger children. It was time for them to contribute to the day's work. Under their mother's watchful eye, they gathered eggs from the chickens, milked the cow, and gathered firewood. The children worked diligently, their small hands working quickly. They were used to helping their parents and understood the importance of their work. As the afternoon wore on, the family worked tirelessly. The father and Thomas returned home just as the sun began to set, their bodies aching from a day of labor. They shared a tired smile, understanding the unspoken bond that united them. Back at the cottage, the family gathered for dinner. The evening meal, a simple affair of vegetables, cheese, and perhaps a bit of meat, was eaten in silence. Each member of the family was lost in their own thoughts, reliving the events of the day. After dinner, the family came together for a final activity, spinning and weaving wool. By the flickering light of the hearth, they transformed raw materials into usable goods. The rhythmic clatter of the spinning wheel filled the cottage, creating a soothing melody. Finally, it was time for bed. The children, tired from a day of work, were tucked into bed by their parents. As the family slept, the sounds of the night filled the cottage, the wind howling outside, the fire crackling in the hearth. They were safe and warm in their little cottage, ready to start a new day in the life of a medieval peasant. And that's it for today. What did you think? How do you think a day in the life of a medieval peasant went? Do you have any other thoughts or ideas you want to share? Leave a comment down below. We'd love to hear from you. Also, remember to check out our other videos. We think you'll really like them. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. The sun peeks over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. Birds chirp merrily, heralding the start of another beautiful day in medieval Europe. But for our peasant family, the sun's gentle caress is their alarm clock, rousing them from their slumber. Their day begins at the crack of dawn, just like the rest of us. But what exactly did a typical day in the life of a medieval peasant look like? Did they spend their days toiling in the fields, tending to animals, or were there other activities that filled their day? Join us as we take a journey back in time and explore the daily life of a medieval peasant, shedding light on their routines, responsibilities, and the challenges they faced every day. Morning work. The rooster has just crowed, signaling the start of a new day. Our peasant family is already up and at work. For men, women, and children. The early hours are spent on essential tasks related to agriculture, the backbone of their economy. Men typically head out to the fields with their oxen, while some might start their day by sharpening their tools. Oxen were not only used for plowing the fields, but also for transporting goods, and even serving as a source of milk and meat. For the men, working with these strong animals was a necessity, and they developed a deep bond with them over time. While the men tend to the oxen, the women are busy with other chores. Some might join the men in the fields, wielding tools alongside them. Others might gather herbs or prepare animal fodder. And still, others might stay home to spin wool or flax into usable materials. These tasks may seem simple, but they require skill and precision. Each activity contributes to the survival and prosperity of the family. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, the family's work continues. Some are engaged in planting or harvesting crops, while others are cutting hay or tending to livestock. This is the time when the entire family is most likely to be together, working side by side to complete the most labor-intensive tasks. Children, too, have their roles to play. While they might not handle sharp tools or heavy equipment, they can help in other ways. Younger children might weed the fields, while older ones might herd animals or assist with repairs. For those who don't have land of their own, this part of the day might involve working for a lord or a member of the clergy on their estates. This could include the same tasks mentioned earlier or other duties assigned by the landowner. In return, they would receive a portion of the harvest or a wage that could sustain them through the year. After a morning of hard work, it's time for a well-earned break. The family gathers for an early lunch, sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and perhaps some fruit if it's in season. The midday sun beats down, but the family finds solace in the shade of a tree or the shelter of their homes. It's a time for rest, but also an opportunity to connect with one another. The rhythm of life in the Middle Ages was dictated by the seasons and the needs of the land. So while the summer months were filled with the bounty of the harvest, the winter brought with it the challenge of scarcity. During the winter months, work didn't stop, but its nature changed. When the crops were gathered in, the focus shifted to repairs and maintenance. Fences needed fixing, tools had to be sharpened, and barns cleaned. Livestock also required extra care during the colder months, and the family would often work together to ensure their animals stayed healthy. Indoor tasks also took priority during the winter, such as spinning yarn, weaving cloth, and preserving food for the leaner months ahead. With shorter days and limited daylight, the family had to make the most of the hours they had. Another important aspect of a medieval peasant's life was their relationship with their community. Village life was tight-knit, and the peasants relied on one another for support and cooperation. During the busy planting and harvest seasons, neighboring families would often work together, helping each other out to ensure the success of the crops. This sense of community extended to times of hardship as well. If a family suffered a crop failure or a disease outbreak, the other villagers would often step in to help them through their difficulties. Religious obligations were also a significant part of a peasant's life. The medieval church held a strong influence over people's lives, and the peasants were expected to attend services regularly. They also participated in religious festivals and rituals, which often coincided with agricultural cycles. These events not only had a spiritual significance, but also served as a way to bring the community together. For many of us, the idea of working from dawn till dusk every day might sound like a daunting task. But for the medieval peasants, it was simply a part of their everyday life. They didn't do it because they enjoyed hard, back-breaking labor. They did it because it was often the difference between going hungry and having enough to eat. It's important to remember that their world was vastly different from ours. They didn't have the luxury of modern conveniences or safety nets that we often take for granted. As we delve deeper into the daily life of a medieval peasant, it's crucial to understand the context of their lives. They lived in a world where the weather played a pivotal role in their survival. A good harvest meant the difference between prosperity and famine. The threat of disease loomed large, and illnesses could quickly decimate a population. To make matters worse, their world was often disrupted by conflicts and natural disasters, which could wipe out years of hard work in a matter of days. In the face of these adversities, the peasants displayed remarkable resilience and adaptability. They developed sustainable farming practices that allowed them to make the most of their resources. They created tight-knit communities that provided mutual support, and they held fast to their religious beliefs, which offered them hope and solace in times of trouble. Their stories are a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure and thrive, even in the most challenging of circumstances. What struck me the most about the peasants' way of life is their resourcefulness. They didn't just endure their hardships. They found ways to thrive within the constraints of their world. They developed innovative farming techniques that maximized yields. They made the most of every natural resource available to them, and they built strong communities that supported them through thick and thin. Their story is one of resilience, adaptability, and innovation in the face of adversity. It's a reminder that no matter how challenging our circumstances may seem, we always have the power to adapt, innovate, and thrive. Perhaps the most valuable lesson we can learn from the peasants is the importance of community. Their tight-knit villages weren't just a place to live, they were a lifeline. They were a support system that helped them through the inevitable ups and downs of life. In a world where individualism is often celebrated, it's easy to forget the power of community. But the peasant's story is a powerful reminder that our strength is multiplied when we come together to support one another. As we reflect on the daily life of a medieval peasant, let's take a moment to appreciate the resilience, resourcefulness, and community spirit that define their way of life. Let their story inspire us to find strength in adversity, to innovate in the face of challenges, and to value the power of community. After all, their story isn't just a part of history. It's a story of humanity, a story that continues to shape our world today. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more exciting historical journeys. Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to spend a day in the life of a medieval peasant. It's the year 1348, and you wake up just before sunrise to the sounds of animals waking up in their pens and roosters crowing. The smell of wood smoke from your neighbor's chimneys drifts through your window. Mixing with the scent of stale urine and chamber pots that hangs about your home, your wife has already risen and begun preparations for the day. Your two eldest sons are up too, helping out where they can. Your daughters, still sleepy-eyed, help feed the chickens, while your youngest son is still snoring softly in his pallet. The day before, you finished a long job repairing the village well, and today's market day. So you need to be up bright and early to get to town before the crowds arrive. With a quick breakfast of bread and cheese, you set off down the lane. Sleepy history. Midday meal for most of us. Lunchtime means a break in our busy days filled with meetings and deadlines. We take our breaks at our desks, sometimes heating up leftovers from the night before in the office. Microwave, or unwrapping yet another sad sandwich from the one we brought with us. But what did peasants eat for lunch? For those who lived during the Middle Ages, midday meals consisted of whatever they could spare. While it might sound like a grab-and-go affair, there was a lot more to peasant lunches than meets the eye. What was the midday meal called? Lunch didn't have a special name back then. It was simply called dinner, the midday meal, or the meal eaten at noon. Dinner was usually a light meal compared to the evening supper, because it was eaten around midday when the sun was high and people were untired enough to settle in for the night. What did a peasant eat for lunch? If you're reimagining a peasant sitting down to a dainty meal at a small table with plates of food, you'll have to keep daydreaming. Peasants rarely sat down to eat lunch. Instead, they took their food with them and ate while working in the fields. This was especially true if they were traveling to the market. During harvest season, a peasant family might bring along a crust of bread and some fruit to sustain them during the long hours of labor. When it was too busy to stop for a full meal, this was also an easy way to keep food fresh longer, since bread, unlike meat, doesn't spoil as quickly. Sometimes a hot meal was possible. In fact, many medieval families had a custom to eat a small hot meal together before leaving their homes in the morning and returning in the evening. This would warm their bodies as they started their long days and cool them as they ended them. When they traveled to markets, peasants who lived near towns might stop at an inn for a quick meal. However, these establishments were costly, so eating out wasn't a regular occurrence. Peasants were careful not to overindulge at lunchtime because they wanted to save their strength for the evening meal. Eating too much during the day could make them sleepy. And since there was no refrigeration, any uneaten portions of their meal would spoil by nightfall. Pottage, everyone's favorite medieval dish. A medieval peasant's diet consisted primarily of grains like wheat, oats, barley, and rye, supplemented by vegetables grown in their gardens or foraged from the wild. Meat was expensive and rare except on special occasions. Because of this, the majority of their dishes were vegetarian. One such dish was pottage, a thick vegetable soup made with whatever produce was available. A simple recipe might combine chopped onions, cabbage, carrots, leeks, and parsnips with a small amount of grain. The mixture would then be boiled until the vegetables were tender. Herbs and spices like ginger, cumin, saffron, and salt added flavor. Some recipes even included milk or cream. In the end, the result was a hearty, thick soup, ideal for sustaining workers through long hours of labor. Although pottage might seem like a humble dish today, it was the perfect medieval peasant food. It stretched ingredients over several servings, required minimal preparation, and was nutritious and filling. Since pottage was so common, every region of medieval Europe developed its own variations. Some French pottages might contain ingredients like barley, turnips, and mustard greens. Meanwhile, English pottage could feature ingredients like millet, leeks, and onions. Even milk or small fish could make an appearance. For variety, peasants also enjoyed a wide range of breads. From simple white loaves made with flour and water to sweeter breads made with eggs and milk. They also ate cheese, either homemade or purchased from a local farmer. Salted pork or bacon was a rare treat. It could be served as a side dish or used to add flavor to other dishes. When did peasants eat lunch? Medieval peasants' schedules varied depending on the time of year and their distance from town. Farmers typically ate dinner between 12 and 1 p.m. after finishing their morning chores. Those who worked in crafts or trades might eat earlier or later, depending on the demands of their jobs. Peasants traveling to the market might take their lunch with them and eat on the road. During harvest season, a peasant's lunch might be little more than a bite of bread and a swig of water. How did peasants eat their lunch? Medieval peasants didn't sit down to eat their lunches. Instead, they took their food with them and ate while working in the fields or on the road. When they did eat at home, they might take turns eating while the others worked. The meal was often eaten in silence, but some families prayed before eating. How much did a peasant spend on lunch? During the Middle Ages, money was not a major concern for most peasants, because they grew most of their own food and made their own clothes. They didn't have to spend much money on things like shoes or hats either, because those items could be repaired rather than replaced. However, if a peasant needed to buy something new, he might have to visit a merchant or a traveling peddler. Peasants were careful not to spend too much money on lunch, because they didn't want to waste their hard-earned cash on unnecessary items. They knew that their money was better spent on things like tools or seeds, which could help them produce more food or earn more money in the future. Did anyone ever eat lunch alone in the Middle Ages? While it was common for medieval peasants to eat lunch while working in the fields or on the road, they usually didn't eat alone. Most peasants traveled to the market with their families or other villagers, and they would eat lunch together while working. If a peasant did eat lunch alone, it was likely because he or she was sick or otherwise unable to work. Did King Richard the Lionheart eat lunch? Like other medieval royalty, King Richard the Lionheart likely ate lunch from a menu that was much more varied and extravagant than that of the average peasant. His midday meal might have included roasted meats, fresh fruits and vegetables, and fine cheeses. However, his schedule was likely much busier than that of the average peasant, and he may not have had time to sit down for a leisurely lunch. Instead, he may have had his food brought to him while he worked or traveled. Why do we eat lunch now? Our modern concept of lunchtime is largely the result of the Industrial Revolution. As factories and offices became the norm, people needed a break from their busy schedules to recharge and refuel. Lunchtime became a time for people to socialize and relax before heading back to work. What did medieval peasants wear to lunch? Medieval peasants wore practical clothing that could stand up to the demands of their jobs. Men typically wore tunics and hose, while women wore dresses and aprons. Everyone wore sturdy shoes that could protect their feet from the elements. Most peasants didn't change their clothes for lunch, but they may have removed their aprons or other soiled clothing to keep it clean for special occasions. So what do you think? Would you like to trade places with a medieval peasant for a day? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're at it, be sure to subscribe to my channel for all your medieval history needs. Thanks for watching. A day in the life of a medieval peasant. Sleepy history. The sun is barely up, and it's already time to get to work. For many medieval peasants, their day began at dawn. Although some luckier peasants might have been able to sleep in until sunrise, either way, getting up early was essential because there was no shortage of chores to do around the homestead. But first, breakfast. Ho ho, good morning. Everyone's favorite meal of the day. While it may not have been everyone's favorite in reality, peasants were lucky if they were able to eat breakfast at all. Many didn't have enough food to spare for an early morning meal, and so went straight to work. Those that did eat breakfast would probably have something simple like bread and cheese or fruit and nuts while they tended to their morning duties, such as milking a cow or gathering eggs from the chickens. Of course, those living in colder climates would need to tend to their animals, for the sun rose and they themselves would probably want to get out of the barn before it got too chilly inside. In fact, most peasants lived in the same basic style house that they worked in, with the main living space and bedroom connected to the kitchen and dining room and often attached to a stable or barn, so it wouldn't be unusual for a peasant to start their day milking a cow and then share a quick breakfast with their family before heading out into the fields. Afternoon duties. After a long morning of back-breaking labor, it was time for lunch. For most peasants, this meant another helping of coarse bread, perhaps with cheese or fruit, although some wealthier peasants might be able to afford meat occasionally. Lunch was usually eaten in the fields while continuing farm work, although some peasants might head home briefly. It was important to take a break and eat something hearty to keep the energy up and prevent exhaustion, and once everyone was well fed, it was back to work until sunset. This meant returning to the fields to continue planting, harvesting, or tending to crops. Depending on the season, some peasants might use the afternoon to repair tools or do other odd jobs around the farm. Others might use the time to pursue a trade or craft. Many peasants were farmers first and foremost, but also had other skills. Some might work as carpenters, blacksmiths, or tanners on the side and sell their wares at local markets. It was uncommon for peasants to specialize in a secondary skill and earn extra money for their efforts. After all, working as a farmer alone rarely brought in enough income to support a family, so any extra money earned was vital for survival. After the sun dipped below the horizon, it was finally time to call it a day. Most peasants headed home after a full day of work, although some might stay behind to care for livestock or complete urgent tasks. Once home, it was time for a well-deserved dinner. Similar to breakfast, dinner would often consist of bread and cheese or fruit, nuts, and porridge. If the family was lucky enough to have a bit of meat left over from market day, they might eat that as well. The whole family likely ate together before calling it a night. Parents would tuck their children in for bed and then probably spend some quiet time with their spouses, discussing the events of the day or planning for tomorrow. Most medieval peasants slept in large families, with several generations often living under one roof. This meant that even if a peasant's own children were grown up and had families of their own, they might still live at home with their parents and siblings. As such, it was unheard of for a peasant family to have as many as 10 people sleeping in one small house. Peasants slept in a variety of places, from simple straw pallets to wooden beds, depending on their wealth. Even poorer peasants might own a straw pallet or a sack filled with straw or hay that they could call their own, though wealthier peasants could afford wooden beds with linen or wool blankets and pillows. But even those who shared beds likely appreciated having a place to sleep away from the elements. After all, most peasant housing was little more than a single room with a dirt floor and thatched roof. There was rarely any furniture outside of a dresser and table, if that, and families had to keep their livestock close by for warmth. So a simple bed, whether shared or solitary, was a welcome addition to any peasant's home. It was also customary for families to put their animals into the barn or stable for the night. Before retiring, this kept predators away from their food source and ensured that the animals would stay warm in the winter months. After making sure everyone and everything was safely tucked in for bed, it was finally time for the peasants to call it a night and try to get some much-needed rest before the next day began. On feast days or Sundays, not every day in the life of a medieval peasant was the same. From time to time, there would be a feast day or holiday when work could be put aside for a bit and merriment could ensue. Sunday was often a day of rest when peasants would attend church services and then gather afterwards for a communal meal. This gave them a chance to socialize and enjoy some music and dancing before returning to their daily routine. Of course, these breaks were few and far between. For the most part, a medieval peasant's life was filled with hard work and little free time. They spent their days working in the fields or caring for livestock and their nights eating, sleeping, and resting before starting the cycle anew. While it may seem idyllic to us now, life as a medieval peasant was anything but easy. Between the long hours, back-breaking labor, and constant worry about food and shelter, it's no wonder many of us can't imagine living as a medieval peasant, even for a day. Medieval peasant housing. Medieval peasant housing varied greatly depending on where you were in Europe. In general, however, medieval peasant homes were simple affairs. Most were built from whatever materials were available locally, such as wood, stone, or brick. They typically consisted of a single room with a dirt floor and thatched roof. Though larger homes might have multiple rooms or even an attached stable or barn, furniture was sparse and consisted mainly of a dresser and table, if that. Peasants would eat, sleep, and cook in the same room, and their animals would be kept nearby for warmth and protection from predators. It may not have been much, but it was home. What did medieval peasants eat? Medieval peasants were mostly farmers who grew their own food, but they also supplemented their diets with what they could buy at market. In general, the staple of the peasant diet was bread, which was made from whatever grain was in season. Other common foods included vegetables, cheese, and fruit, although poorer peasants might struggle to get enough food and were more likely to go hungry. Life as a medieval peasant. A typical day in the life of a medieval peasant was filled with hard work and little free time. They spent their days working in the fields or caring for livestock, and their nights eating, sleeping, and resting before starting the cycle anew. It may not have been much, but it was home. Did you know? Unlike the nobility and even some members of the merchant class, medieval peasants were rarely able to read or write. Many couldn't even afford basic clothing or shoes. Their lives were tough, but they persevered. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a comment below to let me know what you thought. Thanks for watching. See you next time. In our series, A Day in the Life, we explore what life was like for people living in various historical periods. From the clothes they wore to the food they ate, from their jobs to their homes. We bring history to life through the experiences of the people who lived it. Today we're off to medieval Europe to spend a day in the life of a peasant. For those of you who haven't yet started your weekend, happy Friday. And for those of you who have already made it through the work week, happy Monday. Welcome back to the channel. Peasants were poor farmers who farmed the land owned by a lord or a king. The vast majority of people living in medieval Europe were peasants. They worked long hours every day doing hard labor. Their lives were tough. But there was some time to relax and even have fun. Let's find out more. Evening, after a long day of working in the fields, Family is ready to call it quits. The sheep are back in the pen, the cows are lowing for their milking, and dinner is being prepared. One of the children might be sent to the barn to help feed the animals, while another sweeps the floor of the house with a broom made of twigs and straw. Maybe a father chops wood to keep the fire going. This time of year, there's plenty of wood to chop. Winter is coming, and he wants to make sure that there's enough fuel to keep the family warm during the cold months. Depending on the season, the tasks that needed to be done could change. But at this time of year, right before winter began, there was always plenty of wood to chop. Chopping wood was one of the most common evening chores. It was also good exercise after a long day of field work. Plus, you got to take out your aggression on a log. What could be better? Well, how about if the person doing the chopping was paid for his work? Now, that would be great. But unfortunately, a peasant wasn't paid for his work. He owned nothing. His lord owned everything. So if he wanted to live on his lord's land, he had to work for him without pay. Occasionally, a peasant could negotiate a small plot of land for himself, but generally they were just laborers. Sometimes they were allowed to keep some of the crops that they grew, but most of it went to their lord. There was usually an annual tax that the peasant had to pay when the harvest came around. The amount varied depending on where the peasant lived, but it was almost always far more than the peasant had to eat. So why didn't they just run away? Wouldn't it be easy to pack up and move somewhere else? Well, yes, it would be easy to leave, but where would they go? Most peasants couldn't read, much less navigate an entire country without roads or street signs. And besides, where would they get food? Where would they get supplies? And most importantly, where would they get a new lord to work for? The peasant was bound to the land, and that land was owned by the lord. Now that dinner is ready, the family gathers together at the table. The meal is light tonight. Earlier, they had stew, which required lots of fuel to cook. Tonight, there's bread, maybe some porridge. Everyone fills his or her belly, and then it's time to gather by the fire again. Maybe the mother knits, while the father tells stories of his youth. Maybe there's a traveling bard who stops by and plays music or sings folk songs. In the flickering firelight, the family listens, enjoying the break from their busy lives. A fire was important in every peasant's home. It was used for cooking, for warmth, and most importantly for light. But the fire wasn't just used inside the house. Many families would build a larger fire outside and use it for cooking larger meals. In the evening, the fire was a source of light and comfort. People would gather near it and tell stories, sing songs, or pray. Prayer was important to peasants. While many never attended church because they couldn't afford the time or the taxes required to do so, they still prayed every day. Each morning when they woke up and each night before they went to bed, they prayed to God for help and guidance. If things were particularly difficult, they might pray for a miracle. It's getting late. The children are yawning and rubbing their tired eyes. It's story time now. Stories were an important part of medieval peasant life. They provided entertainment, of course, but they were also a way of passing the time. There weren't many clocks around, so people told each other the time by the position of the sun or the stars. Since there weren't many clocks, there wasn't much else to do. It was hard to keep track of time, so stories were a way to pass the hours until bedtime. While the adults might share stories of their youth or tales of daring knights and fearsome dragons, the children snuggle near the fire, listening intently to every word. Eventually, everyone is too tired to keep their eyes open any longer. The children say their prayers and then crawl into bed with their parents. Even though the family doesn't have much, they have each other and they have God. That's all that really matters. The next morning, the rooster will wake them up early and the cycle will begin anew. As the sun dips below the horizon, the sky turns orange, red, and purple. It's a beautiful sight, but the family can't enjoy it. They're too busy getting ready for bed. The cattle are lowing in the barn, the sheep are bleating in their pen, and the pigs are rooting around in the mud. The family lives in a small village surrounded by fields. In the distance, you can see the Lord's castle. Life for a peasant was tough. There was always more work to be done. Crops needed to be planted, the animals needed to be fed. But at the end of a long day, when the sun was setting, and the sky was filled with color, a peasant could take a moment to appreciate the beauty around him, a moment to relax, to enjoy the company of his family, and to thank God for all his blessings. And that's a wrap on our day in the life of a medieval peasant. How did you like this video? Did you learn anything new? Let us know your thoughts. And forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to get notified when we publish a new video. Thanks for watching. Bye. Well, good morning, everyone. Today we were talking about what a day in the life of a medieval peasant might have been like. This is part of my series called Sleepy History, where I talk about all aspects of the medieval period, usually focusing on the clothing, food, and lifestyle of the people who lived back then. We're talking about a day in the life of a peasant woman. Now, this isn't going to be a very exciting episode because really that was the point. Peasants were not living an exciting life. They were working hard, yes, but it was very monotonous work. We can glean a lot about their daily lives from a letter written by a peasant woman named Agnes, which was dated 1368. And so that as the time period that we are going to be talking about for this particular episode. And it's also worth noting that I'm going to be making a follow-up episode about what a day in the life of a peasant man might have been like. Because of course they would have had different responsibilities than the women did. But for now, let's just focus on the women. So the first thing I want to talk about is their home. So Agnes, when she was writing this letter, she was staying at her brother's house because her own home was being repaired. And this isn't unusual. Thatches needed to be replaced every few decades, and entire roofs needed to be redone. And oftentimes the roof was the main living space. It was the only room in their small one-room thatched cottage. And so they had to vacate the premises while that was being done. Her brother's house, however, was a little bit larger. It had 2 rooms, and that was a rare luxury, to have more than one room. So they moved into the second bedroom there, which was described as a poor room. The walls were hanging by their hair, the windows were broken, and the door didn't fit its frame. But it was still better than having to share a room with animals, because in the winter months, that was what they had to do. They would take down their reed screens, which separated their small cottage into human and animal sections, and they would move in with their animals. Presumably the cow and sheep, maybe even chickens, depending on how many animals they owned. And they did this to keep warm. The animals would generate heat, and they would share that heat with the humans. The floor of these homes was usually dirt, and oftentimes it was strewn with straw, which made it easier to sleep on. They would sleep on straw beds, and those straws would be packed down so tightly over years that they would become flat. In fact, they would stay in that state for around 3 years, and then the peasants would have to pull up the old straw and replace it with new straw. Another thing to note is that these small cottages had one big opening where a door would have been, but it really served as both a door and a window. And there would be a shutter to cover that opening at night to keep out the elements, and sometimes to keep out potential thieves. But other than that, there really wasn't any glass. And so whatever smoke was generated from the fire in the center of the room would fill up the room and permeate throughout the house. There really was no chimney, as far as furniture went. If they were lucky, they might have had a stool, a table, and a chest, but probably not all 3. If they were wealthy, they might even have a spinning wheel or a loom. But really, that was about it. It was pretty sparse living arrangements, but it was home. Right, so let's talk about what Agnes did during her day. Now, this is very anecdotal, because again, this is just one person's story, but it gives us a good idea. So she mentions that when she was younger, before she got married, she would wake up early, tend to the animals, milk the cows, gather fuel and water, do some spinning and weaving, and then go to the fields to work as a hired laborer. Now, in her older age, she was too crippled to do all of that, so her days consisted of praying, spinning, and weaving. So let's break that down a little bit. When she was younger, when she was capable of doing physical labor, she would have worked alongside her husband in the fields. She would have planted crops, cared for animals, gathered fruit and nuts, gathered firewood, things like that. And when she was older and could no longer do that kind of work, she would spin and weave. And I think that's important to note here. It wasn't seen as a chore, it wasn't something that she disliked. It was actually something that she was able to do at home in the comfort of her own home, or at least in the second bedroom of her brother's home. And it provided her with a means of income, because she could sell the textiles that she made. In fact, in the letter, she mentions that she needs to finish up a tablecloth, which indicates that she was working on an order. Somebody wanted this tablecloth from her, and she needed to make sure that she finished it so she could send it to them. Now, she also mentions in this letter that she has 2 daughters who are working as hired laborers, and that was common. In fact, It was expected that daughters would start working at a very young age. They would work alongside their mothers until they were married. And then, when they were married, their labor went to their husband's family. In fact, it was expected that after a woman was married, she would leave her family home and move into her husband's home and live there. She wouldn't come back to visit her parents very often. If she did, it was usually only for special occasions, or if she was sick and needed help, or something like that. Now, the letter that Agnes wrote was actually to her son, and she was asking him for money. He owed her 2 shillings, and she needed him to pay her back. He had promised her that he would pay her back, but he kept putting it off. This was a common occurrence. In fact, most historians agree that there were quite a few laws and regulations put in place to try and protect peasant women from exploitation, but they rarely, if ever, got enforced. Women were constantly fighting for their rights. They were constantly trying to gain autonomy over their own bodies and over their own labor. But unfortunately, most of the time, men found ways around it. I know that's not a happy note to end on, but that's just the way it was. And if you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to hit that thumbs up button below. Also, check out my social media accounts for more information about the Middle Ages. Alright everyone, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something new. I will see you next time. Bye. In today's video, we are going to look at what a medieval peasant would wear during the Middle Ages. Welcome back to the channel. It's me, and today we're talking about clothing. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. This is part of a series on medieval peasant life. In this series, we will be looking at what they wore, what they ate, how their homes were built, and even some entertainment they enjoyed. The Middle Ages lasted for over 1,000 years. We're looking mainly at Western Europe during this time period. There were many social classes during the Middle Ages, but today we will be focusing specifically on peasants. Peasants made up the majority of the population during this time period. They were usually poor and had very little rights. Most peasants lived in small villages and worked the land for a lord or lady who owned the manor. A manor was a type of medieval estate, self-sufficient community which consisted of the peasant's village, the lord's residence, and the land worked by the peasants. Peasants worked from sunup to sundown to make sure crops were planted and harvested and animals cared for. They had to give a portion of their payment to their lord in order to work on his land, so it was not uncommon for peasants to be in debt to their lord. This is why many historians refer to the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, because most people lived in poverty during this time period. But there were a few bright spots, such as art, literature, and religious architecture. And these things helped pave the way for the Renaissance. So let's get into it and talk about what the peasants wore. Women, men, and children all wore similar styles of clothing. The main difference between the clothing worn by men, women, and children was the length of the garment. For example, a man's tunic would reach his knees, while a woman's or child tunic would go to their ankles. Adult men typically did not wear tunics that reached their ankles, like the women and children. This is because they had to bend over and lift heavy objects frequently, and longer tunics would have gotten in their way. The typical tunic was made from coarse woolen material, and oftentimes would be patched together from different pieces of fabric. A good quality wool would have been expensive. So oftentimes peasants had to make do with what they had and patch their clothes until they just couldn't end anymore, and then they would just make new clothes from more scrap fabric. Sometimes a peasant might have a good bit of linen, cloth from flax they grew, or maybe an old shirt that had been passed down that was made from linen. They would use this good quality fabric for their under tunic. Then they would put a coarser wool tunic over it. The outer tunic could be belted or go unbelted. During the colder months, a coarse woolen cloak was also added for extra warmth. Men typically wore their tunics tucked into a pair of breeches. Breeches were a type of short pants that came down to mid-thigh. They were made of leather or wool. Oftentimes a man would wear a belt with his breeches. When he would work, he would pull up his tunic so that it didn't get in the way. Sometimes, depending on the time period and where in Europe the man lived, he might have worn hose. Hose were a type of tight-fitting pants that went from the waist to the knee and were often made of wool. On his feet, a man might have worn wooden clogs or leather shoes. These would have been practical for working on the farm. Women also wore a two-piece set. Their under-tunic would have been made from linen if they had it, or else it would have been made from wool like the rest of their clothing. The under-tunic would have reached their ankles. Over this, they would have worn another tunic. This one would have been shorter, reaching about mid-thigh. The full skirt of the undertunic would have been tucked into a waistband to keep the skirt of the undertunic from showing. This outer tunic would have been belted. Women did not typically wear hose like the men did, but they would have worn a pair of leggings that reached about mid-thigh. Underneath the tunic, they would wear a coarse woolen skirt. Just like the men, women would wear a coarse woolen cloak during the winter months to stay warm. And on her feet she would have worn leather shoes or wooden clogs. Children would have worn similar clothing to adults, but their garments would have been a bit longer, so they wouldn't outgrow them as quickly. And they also would have gone barefoot unless they could afford a pair of shoes. Everyone wore a belt, whether it was made from leather or a woven fabric. It wasn't just used to hold up your pants, but it was also used to carry different tools needed throughout the day. A farmer would carry a knife, pouch, maybe some bread, and other items that were needed through the day. Underwear was not worn during the Middle Ages, even among the upper classes. Some of the richest people had linen undershirts, but even they wouldn't have worn underwear like we think of today. Body odor was not considered a problem during the Middle Ages. In fact, the smell was used to distinguish people based on their social class. Someone who bathed regularly would have smelled like flowers or herbs they used in the bath. Someone who was poor and didn't bathe regularly would smell like stale waste and stale sweat. It was believed that bathing every day washed away the oils that protected the body from bacteria. Also, during the Middle Ages, baths were rare. Hot water was thought to draw out impurities from the skin, and cold water was better for cleaning. The peasants definitely did not have access to private baths. However, in some villages there would be a public bathhouse. Typically, a bathhouse was only open for certain days of the week, and the peasants would have to bring their own water to be heated. Bathing was a community event. There would be multiple people in the bath at the same time. People would gossip and share news while they were bathing together. It was not uncommon for someone to have a cold bath. It was believed that a cold bath could help with inflammation and fevers. And the water would be drawn from a well or spring and then heated in a large pot over a fire. Sometimes urine was added to the bathwater because urine was sterile, and it was believed that it could help with cleaning wounds and soothing irritated skin. Urine was also used to wash clothes instead of soap. The public bathhouses would be filled with all ages of people bathing together. Adults would share a bath with young children. Even infants would be submerged in a tub with adults and older children. To prevent babies from getting too cold, they would be wrapped in a blanket after their bath. During the Middle Ages, people believed that head lice and other parasites were a sign of wealth. Having someone clean your clothes and bathe regularly was a luxury. Back then, perfumes and scented oils were used to cover up body odor. Some of the most popular scents at the time were lavender, rosemary, and basil. While bathing was infrequent, oral hygiene was important. People would brush their teeth with a hard bristle brush and scrape their tongue with a metal or wooden scraper. They also used various types of toothpaste, some containing eggshells and others vinegar and salt. Hopefully you learned something today. What did you find most interesting about medieval peasant life? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching. Medieval peasants were poor, and their lives were difficult. We know that. But how exactly did they live? What was a typical day in the life of a medieval peasant like? Welcome back to the channel. Today we were going to find out what a day in the life of a medieval peasant might have looked like. If you've been around these parts before, you know we love bringing history to life for you, and this is part of that mission. So let's hop into our time machine and go back in time to experience history for ourselves. Here we go. The rooster has barely begun his morning song, and I am up and at peace. At least I would be if my lord didn't decide to begin his hunt an hour ago and force me to come along. See, when you're a peasant, your life is completely dictated by the whims of your feudal lord. And I wouldn't mind so much if you just hunted deer or something. But no, he insisted on bringing a small hunting party with us to help flush out the foxes and badgers that pissed him off because they got into his prize-winning chickens. We make our way through the dewy grass, careful not to disturb the sleeping hares and rabbits that are happy to be left alone by both the dogs and us humans. While I keep an eye out for critters to flush, I take stock of my surroundings. I recognize this stretch of land as part of the domain, the portion of the Lord's lands that was worked by the peasants and that peasants could use to grow their own food. Our cottages are probably still asleep, but once the sun begins to climb higher and we return home, everyone will be up and at work. In our village, There are about 30 families who work the fields of our Lord. It's a big manor house, which looks more like a castle than a home. There is also a chapel where the priest will say Mass every morning, and a granary to store the grain we all grow. It's a simple life we lead here, but it's ours. By now, the sky is turning from black to dark blue, and I can hear the birds beginning their morning chorus. As the first rays of sunlight creep over the horizon, I say a prayer to God for protection and to give thanks for another day. I'm a superstitious man, so I do and want to attract the attention of evil spirits while I relieve myself in the bushes. My wife Agnes will be up soon, and the last thing I want is for her to see me in this state. I hurry back to the cottage and shake Thomas awake. He's only 8 years old and doesn't understand yet that a peasant's work is never done. Still, I teach him everything I know, even if he'd rather be out playing. In a few years, he'll be old enough to take over our small plot of land when I am too old to work. For now, though, it's enough for him to help gather kindling for the fire. Agnes is already up and tending the hearth. She's a strong woman, my Agnes, and works just as hard as me in the fields. But she also knows how to soften the bread we eat with her delicious oat cakes. She saves the leftover bits of dough and feeds them to our pigs, who are fattening up nicely for market day. Soon, she'll turn the dough into supper. Maybe a nice stew if we have the coin. Thomas is helping me gather sticks, and we're almost ready to get the fire started. But first, I need to get to work on my quota. You see, last year, I owed the Lord 200 buckets of grain, and so far, I'm behind. I need to get those sacks filled, so I don't incur the wrath of the bailiff, the tax collector. When he comes around, it's best not to be behind on your tithes and dues. If I am caught owing the king, the queen, or the church, I may end up in the pillory. But my greatest fear is being sent to work on the Lord's mill. Anyone who's been there says you're lucky to come back alive. I pull on my tunic and hose and head to the field with Thomas trailing behind me. We walk barefoot, of course. Shoes are for the wealthy, and most of us can't remember the last time we saw a cobbler. The soil is rich here, and I can tell just by looking at it that this year will be a good one. Thanks to the rain, the wheat, barley, and oats I've planted last fall have sprung up and are growing tall. All around me, other villagers are doing the same work, and I call out greetings to the ones I pass. It's a hard life we lead, back-breaking labor from dawn till dusk, but it's a good life. I have my family, my friends, and my faith to see me through the hard times, and there will be hard times. I know that better than anyone. Last year, half our village crops failed because of late frosts, but I have learned to trust in God's plan. He will provide for us. Besides, today's a good day. Sun is shining, the birds are singing, and I haven't seen a single adder in the grass. By midday, my shirt is soaked with sweat, and Thomas and I stop for a breather. He tells me stories about the jousting knights he saw in town yesterday, and I listen patiently until he runs off to play. Then I close my eyes and rest my head on my hoe. Suddenly I hear the sound of a horn and shout to Thomas that we must get back to the village as quickly as possible. The sound of that horn means the Lord has returned and wants us all in the courtyard at the manor house for evening prayer. It's a pain in the ass, really, but I know better than to keep the Lord waiting. Besides, it's only a mile or two away and a great excuse to get out of the sweltering heat of the fields. As I run, I think about the upcoming feast day. It's always a joyful occasion when the church calendar allows us a break from our labors. On feast days, all work stops and we celebrate the saints. And if we're lucky, our Lord will allow us to hold a festival as well. These days are precious few and far between. Other days we must work on our Lord's land and tend our own small plots, but we also set aside time each day for prayer. I round the bend in the road and spot the church in the distance. I quicken my pace and hurry towards the familiar sight of the chapel. I know the first bell is tolled, signaling that Vespers have begun. I peek inside to see Father Anselm leading the congregation in prayer. He's a young priest, recently come from the seminary, and a welcome addition to our village. His sermons are inspiring, and he seems pleased to see us all turn up for Sunday service. Prayer is the center of a peasant's life. Everything we do is in God's name and under his watchful eye. When we plant our crops, we pray for rain. When the harvest comes in, we give thanks to God. We pray before we eat and for protection from evil spirits. Every saint's day and feast day is cause for celebration. And on holy days, like All Saints' Day, we remember those who have passed and hope that they're watching over us. When the service is finished, I stay for a moment to chat with Father Anselm about the upcoming feast day. Will he grant us a day of revelry, or will he insist on austerity? Only God knows. After all, it was only last week that he told us to repent our sins and prepare for the coming of the Lord. I turn toward home, and the sound of church bells fills the air. They're calling us all to supper. I don't look forward to my Lord's supper. He has 5 wives and 20 children, and they all eat like kings and queens. When there's enough for everyone, some of us peasants get a bit of bread or cheese, but usually we're lucky to get a cup of ale. Yet I have more to look forward to than my Lord's supper. When I get home, Agnes will likely have a fresh loaf of bread for me, and nothing makes my day more than the smell of fresh baked bread. And if we're lucky, she'll have gotten a bit of honey from our stash to sweeten it. Or maybe we'll have some dried fruit to put inside. Those are rare treats for us, but a luxury the Lord's table can afford easily. After I wash up in the stream, it's time for supper. The men sit on one side of the table, and the women and children on the other. We eat in silence as we are too tired to talk and too full to want to waste food. Even the children know that wasting food is a sin. After supper, it's time for the night's entertainment. Maybe someone will tell stories or jokes, or perhaps we'll sing songs. If we're feeling bold, we might dance. I tire easily and prefer to spend my evenings listening to others, but I try to join in when I can. Soon, though, it's time for bed. The children are tucked in with their parents, and the adults sleep soundly. The only sounds are the crickets chirping and the owls hooting. Peace is finally upon the land. Tomorrow, we'll wake before the sun and do it all again. That's the life of a peasant. Now it's your turn. What did you think? Would you describe a day in the life of a medieval peasant? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.